We've been talking about silence as a problem to solve, as something to face, to stop running from, to learn to sit with. And that's true. That's real. The confrontation is real. But I want to end this series somewhere different, because the confrontation isn't the destination. What happens after you stop running, after the noise loosens its grip, after the silence stops feeling like a threat, is something that I don't think gets talked about honestly enough in spiritual circles. It gets romanticized, or it gets left vague, or it gets described in language so abstract it stops feeling real. So I want to be concrete about it, because what's on the other side of all this work is not what most people expect. It isn't bliss, it isn't transcendence, it isn't the permanent erasure of difficulty from your life. It's something quieter, and in some ways harder to describe, but far more useful. Let's start with what doesn't change, because the misunderstanding here causes a lot of unnecessary confusion and disappointment. Life doesn't stop being difficult. Problems don't dissolve. People don't become easier. The world doesn't rearrange itself around your inner peace. If that's what you're waiting for, you'll be waiting a long time. What changes is the relationship to difficulty, and that turns out to be everything. Here's the most honest way I can describe it. Before a sustained practice of silence, most of us are living inside our reactions. Something happens, a criticism, a disappointment, an unexpected obstacle, and we are immediately, fully inside the emotional response to it. There's almost no gap between stimulus and state. The event and the suffering are practically simultaneous. After, and I don't mean after a month, I mean after a genuine sustained engagement with stillness, the gap appears. Not because you become cold or detached or spiritually superior, but because the awareness that silence has been strengthening becomes more stable than the thoughts and emotions moving through it. You can watch the anger without becoming it. You can feel the fear without being governed by it. You can notice the pull toward reaction and choose, actually choose, your response. Viktor Frankl wrote it from inside a Nazi concentration camp, possibly the most extreme context imaginable for this insight. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He didn't write that from a meditation cushion. He wrote it from conditions designed to eliminate every last human freedom. And he found that this one, the inner freedom, the gap, could not be taken. Silence is how you find the gap. Practice is how you widen it. The second thing that changes is the quality of presence. And this one is harder to quantify but unmistakable in lived experience. When you are no longer carrying the weight of everything you've been avoiding, when the unlived grief has moved through, when the questions you feared have been faced, when the running has stopped, you become available to the moment you're actually in, to the person in front of you, to the work in your hands, to your own life as it's actually happening, rather than the story of your life that you keep running in the background. This is what makes the quiet ones dangerous, and I use that word deliberately because it surprises people. We associate silence with passivity, with withdrawal, with the absence of force. But the person who is genuinely present, fully, cleanly present, without the static of unprocessed noise, has access to a quality of attention that most people never develop. They see more clearly, they respond more precisely, they waste less energy on the performance of confidence and more on its actual exercise. I want to talk about performance, not in the toxic hustle sense, in the genuine sense of being able to do what you came here to do, with full capacity, full clarity, full presence. And I want to name something that the self-improvement world almost never acknowledges. Most of what gets sold as high performance is actually just compensation for unaddressed inner turbulence. The productivity systems, the morning routines, the habit stacks, they are often attempts to manage from the outside what silence could resolve from the inside. They work, partially, in the way that scaffolding works. But scaffolding is not a building. It holds the structure while the real work happens. At some point, the scaffolding has to come down. The person who has done the inner work doesn't need as much scaffolding, not because they're more disciplined, but because they're less divided. Their energy isn't being split between action and the management of the noise underneath action. It's available, whole. This is documented everywhere if you look for it. The Bhagavad Gita describes it as nishkama karma, action without attachment to outcome. Not passive, not indifferent, fully engaged, fully committed, fully present, but unattached to what the action makes you look like. Unattached to whether it succeeds or fails in the way you hoped. That kind of action is not lazy. It is extraordinarily powerful because it isn't contaminated by the ego's need to protect itself, to be seen, to be right, to avoid failure. It's just the action itself, clean, direct, without the static. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, the radical separation of what is in your power from what is not, and the liberation that comes from investing only in the former. Marcus Aurelius practiced this in the most demanding external circumstances imaginable, not from a place of withdrawal, but from a place of inner stillness that made him more effective, not less. Modern research on what psychologists call flow states, those peak performance experiences where effort feels effortless, where time distorts, where output seems to exceed normal capacity, describes the same territory. Flow is characterized by the temporary dissolution of self-consciousness. The internal critic goes quiet. The gap between intention and action collapses. The person becomes, briefly, fully one with what they're doing. The contemplatives didn't call it flow. They called it absorption, or presence, or the natural state. But they weren't describing something accidental or rare. They were describing a cultivated capacity, something you could develop, something that silence, practiced with enough consistency, gradually makes more available. And then there's the relational dimension, which might be the most underrated consequence of this whole work. The person who has stopped running from themselves has stopped needing other people to fill the space the running left. They are not seeking approval the way they used to. They are not looking for validation, for the reflection of themselves in others' reactions, for the constant reassurance that they are enough. And paradoxically, because they need less from other people, they can give more. They can listen without waiting for their turn to speak. They can love without the grasping quality that love has when it's really a transaction. They can be with someone in difficulty without immediately trying to fix it because they've learned to sit with difficulty themselves. That quality of presence is the rarest thing in most people's lives. And it's what silence ultimately produces in the person willing to stay with it long enough. We started this series with a question hidden underneath a simple instruction: stop running. And across 4 videos, we've looked at what the running costs, where it comes from, the neuroscience, and the fear underneath, what the traditions built to address it, the ancient technologies of inner silence, and now, what becomes possible when the running stops. I want to close with the thread that ran through all of it, because it's easy to lose it in the detail. Every tradition we looked at, Vedanta, Buddhism, Zen, the Desert Fathers, Kabbalah, Sufism, Stoicism, was pointing at the same thing, not at a state to achieve, not at an identity to build, at something that is already present, already whole, already undisturbed, and that becomes accessible not by addition, but by subtraction, by removing what was never real in the first place, The noise was never the truth of you. The running was never the truth of you. The accumulated strategies for avoiding the self, the identities, the opinions, the achievements, and the failures and the stories built around them, none of that was the truth of you. What is, was always there. In the silence, in the stillness, in the space between thoughts that you kept filling before it could speak. And when you finally stop, when you finally give it space, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive. It was never absent. It simply becomes undeniable. If you've watched all 4 of these videos, I want to acknowledge something. You didn't just consume content. You sat with something uncomfortable. You followed a thread into territory that most people avoid, and that willingness, that small act of staying, is not nothing. It's the first movement of everything that follows. I said in the first video, stop leaving, and I meant it as an instruction for what to do in the quiet. But I mean it now in a larger sense too. Stop leaving yourself. Stop filling the gap before it can show you what it holds. Stop performing the version of yourself that needs the noise to feel real. Stop postponing the one encounter that every tradition, every sage, every contemplative in history has pointed toward as the only one that ultimately matters. The encounter with what you actually are. Not the story, not the persona, not the achiever or the victim or the seeker. What you are before all of that. What you remain after all of that. What has always been here, watching, waiting, completely at rest. The silence was never empty. You just kept mistaking it for one. That's the Silent series. 4 videos, 1 thread, and if it's done its job, something in you that was slightly more still at the end of each one than at the beginning. If you want to go deeper into any of the traditions we touched on, Vedanta, Buddhism, Sufism, Stoicism, there's a lot more on this channel, and more coming. Drop in the comments which one you'd like to explore further. That shapes what I make next. And if this series found someone at the right moment, someone who needed permission to stop, or a map for what they were already beginning to feel, please share it, not for the algorithm, because that's what this channel is for. Thank you for being here, for staying, for watching something that asked something of you instead of just giving you something. I'll see you in the silence.